Great. Well, thanks for coming. The title of our session is Using Custom Permissions to Simplify Security. So my name is Daniel Peter. I'm the Salesforce practice lead at Robots and Pencils. That's a brand new role for me, so maybe it's the first time you've heard it. I just started this week. Excited about that. And my co-presenter today is Rod Butters. He is CTO and CMO at, is it CXO now?
CXO now. So, shameless plug, I'm independent consultant at this point. I've been a CTO, a CMO, and a COO at various points in time. So now I'm helping companies that need somebody that can come in and fill any of those shoes and bridge all those things together. And I'm working with a couple of companies right now, one that does a cloud for managing distributed or decentralized storage. I learned this cool fact the other day. Every year, California throws away enough renewable energy to run the city of San Francisco for almost a month. And the answer to that is distributed storage, and so that's what these guys are doing. And I'm also working with some other companies that do hybrid transactional analytics databases. So it's good stuff, fun stuff. Those are some of the things. But Dan was kind enough. We worked together. I was CTO at Canandy. Dan was, what did we call you?
Yeah, I was lead application engineer.
Yeah.
So we worked together in a former life, and now we're reuniting at Dreamforce to do a talk together, so it's pretty cool.
So let's do the talk.
Okay, I have one more intro slide. Maybe some folks don't know who I am, so former lead application engineer at Canandy right there on the slide. I've done various roles in the past, Salesforce MVP, 24 certifications, run the developer group here in the Bay Area. Trying to be very active in the community, give back as much as I can while also having a day job.
Which is amazing to me, how much you do that. I don't know when you have time to sleep. So what motivated this is kind of interesting. When Dan asked me to come and talk on this, he submitted his talk. They said, hey, that's a good one, let's do that. And I actually think it is good. We started looking, first of all, we were at an ISV, we were doing enterprise software. And as we were doing this, we started going after bigger and bigger companies like Johnson Controls, Philips, all these different people. And as we were getting into it, one of the key things always was corporate compliance. As a matter of fact, one of our first companies, a subsidiary of Del Monte Foods, Big Heart Pets, they had a whole audit team that went in and wanted to make sure that they could support corporate compliance with our application on Salesforce. So being able to have security, being able to describe how it worked was really critical. That was one of the motivations that led us even into this in the first place. Just out of curiosity, who here is an ISV and does enterprise software? So this is definitely going to be, I think, interesting to you, because if you're selling to bigger companies, I'm sure that compliance comes up. And who's here a services person? You're a service person. Who's here as a services person? Okay, so if you've got larger clients, probably compliance and setting up permission sets and profiles and all that stuff probably comes up. This could be useful there ultimately as well. And if you're in a large company, I'm just curious, who's here in like a big company and you have corporate compliance officers running around? You've seen one of them? You run the other way? No? You are one. I'm sorry. Okay. No, you're not one. Okay, good. So just to kind of back up for a minute, so what led us to this was the fact that as we were addressing this, setting up permission sets, setting up those things, started becoming more and more and more complex, and we started running into some kind of recurring themes. And again, just as a background, corporate compliance is basically the formal programs specifying how the policies, procedures, and actions within a process are in place to prevent or detect violations of regulations and laws. How are we actually compliant with what do we need to do in the real world to actually not break any rules and get our jobs done? There's actually some really important things in terms of corporate governance behind this. First and foremost is separation of duties. So the classic example of that is I can't make my brother's company a supplier to the company, put in a purchase order for him, and then write him the check you don't want somebody to be able to do that. And it's not because you don't trust your employees, it's just because it's bad business practice to have trust in place to do those things. So separation of duties is what creates the checks and balances and is a key part of compliance. Having those specific roles that are well defined. And one of the things that we ran into is that almost every company we dealt with had different roles, or a different number of roles, or different kinds of roles. And every single time there was something different that we had to deal with and figure out how we would address. Transparency is a key thing. The easier it is to understand exactly what the role is, what the separation of duties are, and how that maps onto things so you can track it, that transparency is important as well. And the other thing that was kind of a learning experience for both of us is this isn't just about financials, because as soon as you get into medical devices or you are a SaaS company doing an offering to somebody else or any of these kinds of things, compliance has a ripple effect, and it covers all aspects of the company. So if I'm a SaaS company and I'm providing services to you and you're a medical device company, well, guess what? I have to go through SOC 2 type audits. I have to have compliance in my system. I have to set this stuff up as well, which we did, and we went through the audit successfully, but it was quite a learning experience. And so on the flip side, the application security has to align and support this. So first and foremost, it's more than, again, just simply limiting visibility for confidential information. It's actually being able to support that separation of duties. It's a key thing. It needs to align to what those roles are. So you have to have a way to map that onto the roles. And again, just going through this as we talk about it, Dan's going to highlight how complex that can be really quickly. It's got to be easy to create. It's got to be easy to maintain, to understand, to communicate. Again, there's challenges with that, and you got to be able to track it, and you got to be able to have controls around it in its own right as well. So this was some of the things that led us to say, hey, there's some challenges here, which we'll talk about, that causes issues in terms of bringing the compliance and the security together. So I'm going to pass the baton.
So just a little bit of background on the Salesforce platform. You're probably familiar with this user mode versus system mode if you're a fairly advanced developer, but maybe beginning developers don't realize this in the beginning. So all the Apex code that you write is actually running in system mode kind of by default. And what this means is user mode follows all these platform level security checks here on the left, where system mode basically does anything it wants. So I have a little joke cartoon there. If you're running in system mode, it's kind of like asking for a sandwich with sudo and the platform says, okay. So how many folks here are familiar with this? When you write Apex, it's running in system mode. Yeah, so they don't really, that's something they should drill into like beginning developer content more, but they don't. It's something you learn along the way. And yeah, as an ISV, you'll fail security review if you don't kind of make the platform run in system mode or in user mode and system mode intentionally. So I'm sure everybody knows this is the big matrix of setting CRUD and FLS. For one object, it's sort of manageable, but as you get more and more objects, this thing gets very tedious, very fast. So, large ISVs have hundreds of custom objects with hundreds of custom fields, and every role needs different access to different fields. And just managing this, do they have access to read, do they have access to edit, kind of spirals out of control. They do give you permission sets, which help you a little bit to layer these in, but still it's maybe not the right level of granularity for all use cases. And the sharing model, this is a slide from Trailhead. So this is about record level security. CRUD and FLS opens up, do you have access to the field or the object, where this opens up, do you have access to the record? So this is part of the platform security. And this one's a little bit easier to implement in Apex. So you just say with sharing, without sharing, whereas the CRUD and FLS, you actually have to check is accessible, is updatable. You have to write all that code yourself or use a framework. So there's kind of two categories of security. Platform security is what we're all used to. And these are the things we're just looking at: profiles, permission sets, the sharing model. And this is all in play when you're doing things like looking at a standard report, looking at a detail page, looking at a list view. That's going to filter it out based on all your CRUD, FLS, and sharing. And this is what everybody thinks of when they think of Salesforce security. This is the platform security. But application security is kind of a category that we create, like as ISVs or as customers, creating code. So you get to decide what application security is in your code. And you can use custom permissions for this. You can use custom objects. You can write this code in Apex, Visualforce, Lightning. JavaScript is part of Lightning. And this you can do at any level of granularity. You can do it looser, tighter than CRUD and FLS. You can have any types of complex conditions. So application security is that custom logic you build, different than what the platform's built.
Thank you. So this then is where we kind of got to this great place with all these wonderful platform security capabilities. Platform security is nice because it's very visible. You can show it to an admin. You can say, see, here's where you can control. You can see what objects are there, what fields are there, who has access to those. You can define your permission sets. That's all good. But, and here's where the rub comes in. How many people use roll-ups? How many people write business logic that goes off and has to change thing in another object someplace else from the one that you actually touched? What if you're actually trying to create a sales order and some of the things you have to do is check the inventory, you have to check the pricing model, you have to check the customer's credit limit. When you actually go ahead and accept the order, you need to lower their credit total available because now they bought something else from you, so their credit is less remaining. When you actually ship something, you have to actually reduce the amount of inventory that's on hand. So there's a lot of things that you do that suddenly create side effects. Those are good things because that's when you're automating the actual business process, okay? But the downside is, hey, wait a minute, this user was only entitled to actually ship something off the dock. They're not actually allowed to go in and make changes to the inventory themselves. That's not allowed. Hey, this person who's actually taking the order, well, they're allowed to actually take the order, but they don't have the rights to actually go in and change what's the credit on hand or the credit limit for the customer. And so as soon as you get into some of these more complex processes, you start ending up with side effects. These are good things, okay? I mean, that's what everybody's paying us for, right? All this automation, so all this stuff works right. But it has the unintended consequence that if I've really locked things down to match what my compliance requires or my separation of duties is requiring, suddenly I've got this object out here that needs to be updated as part of that process on behalf of that user. So if I locked everything down really tight, suddenly somebody has to open everything up exactly in the ways that we don't want. And so basically you're backed into two options. And this can happen in an ISV's app. This can happen when you bring multiple apps together through some type of integration. This can happen in a lot of different situations where suddenly that process, the workflow, something has to go off and update something else. Well, I could go off and grant platform permissions to my user to go off and do some of this stuff. That's kind of a bad idea because what's going to happen? Well, corporate governance is going to say, hey, wait a minute. That guy doesn't have rights to go in and adjust credit limits. That guy doesn't have rights to go in and change inventory on hand for this item. That's somebody who's just doing order entry or they're doing warehouse management or something like that. That is not what they're supposed to be doing. And you're telling me that suddenly you have to open that up? Okay? So you end up in this real weird catch-22 very quickly. The other option is just go back to system mode. It'll be okay. All right? You could do that. However, someday, somewhere along the way, somebody's going to do something that wrote some piece of code or does some side effect and changes something that, according to the corporate compliance, that person was not supposed to have rights to do. Okay? And likewise, corporate compliance is going to have even a bigger issue with that because there's something that happened that they didn't know about or didn't know would occur. Now again, there's different levels of where this comes up, But these were some of the issues that we were running into as we were working with larger customers. So who really cares about this stuff? Well, this is kind of based on some of our experience working with different size companies as we were deploying these applications with complex business logic. And we had everybody from very large companies, and I would define those as somebody who's over $1 billion in revenue, they're publicly held, they're subject to rules and regulations for reporting, and as a result, compliance is something. They have compliance officers, they have compliance policies and processes, and they may have everything from a chief compliance officer and formal programs. What's probably more important, and from our standpoint as either administrators or developers, what happens on the back end of this, because they probably have somebody in charge of change control. And they probably have only certain times that changes can be actually made. And so here you are deploying some app, suddenly you discover that some process won't work because of the security, and you go in and say, oh, just loosen up the permissions right here. And they say, we're not doing that. We're in lockdown right now. We're not doing that. This hasn't been approved. No, the admin can't do that. It has to be somebody who's in charge, separate person who's in charge of the permissions. So large enterprise, this is definitely the most extreme. And it does happen as you start moving out of more of the sales and marketing functions and into actually full back office or operational or even financial situations. The other extreme is the SMB, where most likely the biggest concern for them is really just privacy of information. They don't want the employees at large having access to information. They don't want these kinds of things. But still, they don't want to spend a lot of time and energy trying to set up all the permissions and profiles and all the things that go along with that. They want something that's easy to understand, visible, and easy to explain to people so they know that people have access to the right information and that information only. Medium-sized enterprise probably falls somewhere in between. The point is that this shows up in multiple settings with multiple people. So that was our motivation for looking at what we could actually do with custom permissions as a way to get out of this catch-22 of how do you write complex business logic that has side effects and yet have clear, transparent understanding of what permissions people have. So enter custom permissions.
Yeah, so this is just a screenshot of the custom permissions screen. And the reason I'm putting this on here is so you can see how simple it is. So custom permission is just a permission you define with a name, and you either assign it to a user and they have it or they don't. So much simpler than the CRUD FLS screen we saw before. And after you create it, you can assign it at the permission set level. So that's pretty nice. You can layer these in via the permission sets. And in terms of checking the permissions, we used to have to write code to do this. Andy Fawcett made a library to do this. Used to be a little bit more governor limit greedy to try to check these, but now we've actually got feature management.checkPermission API name. So it's super easy to see if the running user has that custom permission or not in your Apex. Okay, time for some code, some demos.
Everybody wants to see code, right? Yeah.
So I've actually logged into two browsers here. Chrome is a super user and Firefox is a limited user. And we've got an app here. The app is called Cody's Walking Sticks. And sorry, I'm having a cursor issue here. Maybe I need to exit present mode. There we go. So this app is called Cody's Walking Sticks. You can think of this as the world's simplest ERP system we've built with a fun Trailhead customer using it. Then we've got a custom object called sales orders, another custom object called inventories, and we've got a sales order query, which is a custom Lightning app that we built. So if you look here, let's take a look at the inventory first. We've got a warehouse called the Trailhead warehouse. We see there's some quantity, 10,009. Well, you can see we don't even have edit access to this object. No way to edit this quantity. And the sales orders, we can look at all of them and see the sales orders we have access to see, right? This is all leveraging platform security. You can see we have one sales order in here. So maybe we create a new sales order. And we're selling, the only product we sell is walking sticks, so all you have to do is put the quantity in. And let's sell 10 of them. So what we have is a trigger that's going to decrement 10 quantity from our inventory. Oh, we go to do that, we get an error. So this says error because we don't have access to the quantity field. And that's kind of how we want it. We don't want the user editing inventory directly, but we do want this trigger on the user's behalf because they have access indirectly to the inventory through the sales order to be able to access it. So if we switch over to the super user here and look at the permission set for that order entry clerk, we can actually edit this. We can grant access for them to be able to update the inventory. This is a custom permission that we've defined. And we can come back here. We can create a new sales order, give it 10 quantity, and create it. It worked that time. They have access. And I don't know if you remember, our inventory before was 10,009, I think, so this should be, what, 999 now? Yeah. So the trigger worked on the back end, and we're able to control whether our code has access to this or not. So another thing, that's standard functionality with custom backend trigger functionality, but we also have a custom Lightning UI. What this custom Lightning UI is doing is it's querying all the sales orders in the system in user mode, in system mode, and then also we have a hybrid here which queries in system mode but saves in user mode. And this is so you can query things that you don't have access to update and then try to update them and see what happens. So first thing you notice here is in user mode we see our 2 sales orders. System mode here we see 3 sales orders. The reason for that is there's a 3rd sales order in the system created by the super user that this user doesn't have access to. So this just shows when you query in system mode, you're able to see everything in the system versus restricting it to just what the user has. And so on the saving end of that, if you look at user mode here, we see they have this sales order. We have, let's say, a promotion where you have to have a magic word to get a discount on the walking stick. So maybe the user put in abracadabra, and they go to save this. And since it's in user mode, this user doesn't have access to the magic word field. So we could grant them that, but basically what I want to show is user mode's being enforced here. They can't update that field. Let's go to system mode. Right here, save that, it works. So you can see we can access fields we don't really have access to in system mode. Down here, this is the hybrid where we're querying fields, querying records. We get records we don't have access to, like this sales order SO003 was created by the super user. Let's try to update that magic word. Let's call it Dreamforce 2018. And you can see, so we can read the record, but we can't write it. And we can look at the code for this. So here's the code. While it's still fresh in your mind, I just want to show quickly the Lightning component, mostly the JavaScript controller. So you can see for our different methods, like our save in user mode. So this isn't doing a whole lot in this case. This is sort of wrapper, right? This is the JavaScript code calling the Aura methods, which are querying the data in user mode, querying the data in system mode. So let's take a look at, I guess we have to go out and back in. So we'll go into the controller that's calling. And you can see we have like get sales orders, save sales orders users, save sales order systems. All I want to highlight here is the fact that we've built some DML, some CRUD FLS and DML checking. So how many folks have had to do this for like security review? There's many ways to do this, and I'll show you. We have a simple framework, but basically, we create a query object, and what this does is you give it an object, some fields, and you tell it if you want to run it in system mode or not. So we have, we're getting sales orders we're getting both in one call here. We're getting it in system and user mode. We're just kind of being efficient with our round trips. Similar for DML, we created, so we're not doing, database.query. We're wrapping our query in some code that's checking it, which can optionally enforce system mode or not, because the platform always runs in system mode. If we want to do user mode, we have to write code to do it. Similar with DML, we built some frameworks that will check this. So we'll take a look at those frameworks. So the query class, this stuff gets pretty hairy pretty fast because there's many ways you can build it. You can choose, how do you want it to behave when you're querying a field you don't have access to? Do you want it to throw an exception? Do you want it to drop the field out of the query? What if you have a mixture of some fields you have access to and you want like partial success on your ability to access the records or not? This is the kind of stuff you have to build. I don't want to hammer on this too much because this isn't the point of the presentation. Later, I'm going to show you a class doing the custom permissions, but I just want to point out that this is how you do user mode enforcement on a platform that's running in system mode. You have to check all the fields in the query and see if you have access to them or not. And in this case, what we're doing is we're dropping them out of the query, but you could also throw an exception. And as part of our user mode, system mode, we're also respecting sharing. So we have these inner classes without sharing and with sharing. So when you're running in user mode, it's going to say in system mode, query with no sharing. In user mode, query with sharing. And the way you get that is by an inner class that has with or without sharing. So in our lightning demo, we saw in user mode, we had 3 sales orders. In user mode, we had 2. System mode, we had 3. And that's because we were running it without sharing and with sharing, respectively. So we've got another class similar to this for the DML. DML is a little different because when you're querying, you don't so much care about if the field's a formula field or not, but when you're doing DML, you can't update formula fields. And the platform doesn't really differentiate between whether you have access to write the field because it's a formula field or an ID field or a created date field versus whether it's a field you don't have access to because of CRUD and FLS. So these ones can be a little bit more tricky. You might do things, so what I did in this case to handle it is I just had them pass in a set of fields to check. You might implement this differently. You can use describe calls to find out if it's a formula field, but these things start to break down in complex scenarios. So I just say, we're going to hard code a list of fields to check. So we're enforcing system mode, user mode, but the onus is on the user to pass in the fields we want to update. So don't put ID in the field to check because you can never update ID. And maybe you want to loosen up security a bit in the sense that there's some gray area there. So these frameworks can be very complex, anything you can dream up, but that's not really the purpose of the talk. But just realize that to get system mode, to get user mode, you have to create some code like this, both on the query and on the update side of things. So now that we have these classes and we have some user mode enforcement in place, I'll show you how we actually go about leveraging. I showed you on the front end, we assigned that inventory custom permission to the user. So this is going to be how we're checking to see if they have that permission or not. So we've got this class, and this is the new stuff. This is the exciting stuff. This class is called the permissions class. And so what this does is it's got a static Boolean called system mode. This is like, should we be in system mode or not? We've got an execution map, which stores a map of string to execution context. And the execution context is just a simple inner class that says, are we executing right now? And do we have access or not, which is the custom permissions check. Do we have access or not? So this map holds all the contexts we're in, if we're executing or not, and if we have access to them. And you could do some interesting things with this. You could put in your logs, what are all the contexts we're in right now, and so you could, that's why I kind of gave it this custom inner class to give it a little more strong data types. You could use it in your debug framework and things like that. So if we look at this, we instantiate it, and the default is system mode false. And we've got a start action and an end action. We pass in the action we're in, and we say we're starting the action. We create a new execution context, and we put in true, meaning is executing is true, and we put in whether or not they have access to the custom permission. So the name, the developer name of the custom permission is also the same action name that's going to be passed in here. Similarly, when we end the action, now our execution context is false, and this is basically the same permission check. And then we call this method update system mode. So what update system mode does is it iterates through this execution map, and it looks to see if there's any context which we're in, which hasn't been closed, which we have access to. And if we have any one, as soon as we find one, we break out of the loop, and we say that we're in system mode. So there could be many reasons you're in system mode. You could be in 3 different contexts at the same time, all wrapped around each other. And you only need one to be in system mode. So the way we call this, the way we implement it, what I've built is we saw on the front end, we had a sales order, and when you put in some quantity, it's decrementing the inventory. So the trigger that was doing that work is right here. And this is a little bit like the start test, end test, right? We've got permissions.start action, permissions.end action. And what's cool about this framework is you can easily retrofit it into existing code. And as you know, like Salesforce code, in real systems, especially messy systems that have been designed by multiple vendors and things, managed packages, it's hard to predict all the things that are going to fire from a trigger. You have workflows firing triggers, and the triggers are updating other objects. Those other objects you may or may not have access to. So the beauty of this is you wrap the calling code in the start action, end action, and any code that's inside this calling code, even if this is firing workflows and other triggers, since you have that static variable, it lasts for the whole duration of the transaction. So basically everything this is calling, even if you don't know what it's calling, is all going to run in system mode. So it's kind of a compromise, in the sense that you're doing the right level of granularity, and you're not exactly knowing everything that's firing. So from a compliance standpoint, you have to make sure that your developers are writing good code. But assuming that the code is good, and all these downstream things, if someone puts a workflow in there that edits another object that's not really part of this transaction, that could be a problem. But other than that, this is very easy to implement, and it takes into account all the weirdness of the Salesforce platform in the sense that the things that fire can be non-deterministic. So you can think of it as like a short circuit. If you're in this context, you're in system mode for the duration of the transaction. And if you end it, that it'll throw an error. So if we were to move this end action up before it's actually updating the inventory, you'd be able to query the inventory, but you wouldn't be able to update it. So it does respect where you start and end. Yeah, I can get into the details of this trigger a little bit. So basically, this is a bulkified trigger. It's looking at all the sales orders in the transaction. It's looping through the trigger and getting the net change of all sales orders. If the net change is not 0, there's some change, it updates the quantity. And it does that respecting this defined inventory permission. Okay, we're getting a little low on time, but I'll have time for questions afterwards. We need to exit the demo now and go back to the slides.
Cool. So some of the lessons learned out of this. I mean, first off, the net effect of this was exactly what we were after, which is instead of needing to go in and change a whole bunch of CRUD and FLES settings, we could basically give out a custom permission setting that says, hey, this person can go in and enter an order. Great. So they could do everything they had to do with inventory, standard credit limits, all those things. We could introduce a custom permission then, which would be manager can override, and that manager then, when they go in, they would actually be able to do other things. So we were able to accomplish this, and we actually did use this capability in an actual mobile scanner application. One of our engineers, Vinod, actually did some of the early stuff with this, so that only a supervisor could go in and actually change inventory levels through a cycle count, but standard users weren't able to make those kinds of changes. In terms of kind of what we would say would be the lessons learned, first of all, Dan spent time with the security team. They said, as long as you know what you're doing and you have a plan and you consistently apply it, yes, this is an acceptable way to go off and basically simplify giving the security to the users, but still knowing that you have a way to have granularity in terms of who can do what and a controlled fashion in which you're actually using system mode. I think the other thing is, this really is a solution for business processes that touch a lot of downstream objects. So if you're not touching a lot of downstream objects, don't do this. Use platform security. So this really is an 80-20 rule. Only use it for the stuff that you really get a benefit for. And kind of the last point is keep the granularity large. Don't go crazy with this kind of thing to start with. Make big animal things and say, you can do this, because you'll get feedback either from customers, from corporate compliance, somebody, when they need finer granularity, but don't add the finer granularity up front. And so where does it go from here? We're almost out of time. Maybe we take questions, but in a nutshell, you can use this other places where you have Apex code and you have custom permissions and you can test things. One of the things that would be cool is if somebody was working on this and they wanted to open source some cool code, they'd actually do some things where you can create hierarchies on this, so you can create big grain things and fine grain things, management hierarchy, and be able then to control how you give these things out without just, again, going crazy at the fine grain level. Questions? Does this seem useful if you've dealt with this problem?
Yeah, if you have questions, if you could step up to the mic, please, so it'll get on the recording. Thank you.
I don't know if this is as much a question as a request. We have a lot of field level security findings in our static code scanning, and one of the things that has prevented us is the need to be able to subvert, so to speak, or bypass the field level security in certain situations. This gives us that tool. Now we don't have an excuse for building that complex FLS user session stuff. Can you recommend some good frameworks, or can you provide your framework and in the presentation so that we can learn from it?
There's nothing out there, but now there is. So this was something we had to figure out. So we're now releasing to the community. There's the URL.
Thank you.
There's frameworks out there on the CRUD and FLS side for checking that. Financial Force has some, but nobody's really done the custom permission. What execution are you in? Should I grant you system mode or not? So yeah, all the code from today's demo is there.
So who's hit this problem? So I'm glad you came. Glad we could share some stuff. Dan, thanks for submitting this.
Thank you. Yeah, and there's a limited number of swag items, some notebooks and stickers if anyone wants to come grab one on the stage. And we'll be around for a few minutes here. We might have to move out of the room if they have another session, but thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.